The Timbershot Companions, Chapter 37, Samantha's Story. The mad wizard Jarl stumbled backwards. He reached up to the cut on his cheek, touching it for a moment before pulling his fingers away and observing the modicum of blood on his fingertips. As he gazed at the blade in my hand, I saw realization flash across his face. It was the blade, the very same poisoned dagger that had killed my mother all those years ago. Where did you get that? Even under your rule, there were still those that were loyal to my father, I said. The wizard's knees buckled as the demonic poison took hold. He started coughing violently, clutching his chest. He fell to his knees and looked at me with rage-filled eyes. He wheezed. You think you've won? I watched dispassionately. I knew he had been beaten. No matter what he said at this point, it didn't matter. Another coughing fit overtook the wizard. He hunched over and placed his left palm on the marble tile, his right hand clutching his chest, trying to keep himself from collapsing entirely. The coughing turned into a horrible, wheezing laughter. The wizard weakly raised his head and stared at me once again, a cruel smile flashing across his now blood-stained lips. You thought your father merely a prisoner, but he was more than that to me. Much more, he chuckled, spitting blood on the ground. In fact, you and he had many an encounter during your travels. I felt a jolting coldness rushing from the base of my neck all the way down my spine. No, I whispered. It's a shame that in all those years that had passed, you didn't even recognize your own father. I turned and ran, leaving the wizard to his fate. My legs burned as I raced through the dark castle that had once been my home. The hallways and corridors that had been an almost impassable maze only a short time ago were now somehow untangling themselves as the mad wizard's power faded. As the surroundings turned to a more familiar configuration, I picked up my pace, angling for the quickest route to the courtyard. Vendrix later told me that he and the other companions tried to wave me down, but I flew by faster and more on target than one of Eplash's famed magic arrows. There was no stopping me, not until I reached my destination. As I arrived in the courtyard, the early morning rays of what would soon turn into a bright summer's day peeked over the far, snow-covered peaks of the Timbershot Mountains. He was still there, trapped under the statue of the great first king. He didn't notice me at first. His claws raked fruitlessly, trying to find some weak purchase against the colorful mosaic of the now bloody emberstone tiles that covered the ground. His damaged and broken leathery wings, which once haunted my nightmares, lay limp on the ground. I approached cautiously, angling in from the left, where the milky white eye that had been damaged in our first encounter stared unblinking into the distance. It didn't matter. As I drew closer, I saw the great beast pause and sniff the air. He grunted and turned his long neck so he could see me with its remaining good eye. I stared at him, and him at me. No longer was I staring at the eye of a wild beast, ever bent on a crusade to end my life, but the eye of my father. He roared. It was the same roar that had for years summoned a prickly dread at the pit of my stomach, the same screeching "Samasa" that had harrowed the souls of my companions and I as we bided our time in the hidden valleys of the Timbershot Mountains, praying for the terror to pass us by unnoticed. "Samasa," he screeched again. Only this time it was filled with an almost air of melancholy. A tear rolled out of his one good eye. All this time, I said in wonder, reaching out my hand for the snout of the great beast. Samantha! I felt a lump forming in my throat as I pressed my hand against the warm, dry scales of the twisted form of my father. The corners of my eyes felt wet. What? I choked. What did he do to you? The good eye closed, seemingly taking reverence in my touch. I pulled my hand away, shocked with the horror that my father was dying, and I had been the one that killed him. I started rifling through my pouches, throwing aside scrolls and reagents, looking for something, anything that might stop the bleeding. Perhaps there was a drop or two of Vandor's elixir left. "Samantha!" he screeched again, shaking his head sadly. He knew what I was trying to do. "Samantha, no!" Words now. The deep, rumbling tenor of my dad's voice came through. Somehow, despite his twisted form, it was the voice of the man who, while I sat upon his knee as a small child, had read me stories of the great king and his many adventures. I stopped. "I'm sorry," I said, wiping the tears from my eyes. "I didn't know." "Samantha, am sorry, too," my father wheezed, laying his massive horned head down wearily on the emberstone tiles, the warm rays of the sun now glinting in a prismatic rainbow on his scales. I hugged my father's beastly elongated neck as best I could. He grunted in appreciation. His breath was becoming shallower. I moved to my father's right side where he could easily see and sat upon the single stone bench that remained undamaged in the battle. Shifting through my pouches, I located the one item that remained in my possession ever since that night my father had sent my mother and I away for safety those many years ago. Stories of the Great King, Volume 1. I opened the book and located the maple leaf that we used to mark our place. I held it up, and my father smiled sadly. "You said," I sniffled, "you said the next time we saw each other, it would be my turn to read." I used the back of my sleeve to clear the tears from my eyes. I swallowed the lump in my throat as best I could, and remembered the words my father spoke to me during a happier time. "Remember, Samantha, speak loud, speak clear, say what you mean. Your words can be your most powerful ally." I mustered all I could and began. "In the great time before time, when gods and angels still walked the land, and proud giants ruled from the mountain, there lived an ordinary mortal man." I read, line after line, paragraph after paragraph, chapter after chapter, until the sun hung high in the sky. My father lay there, smiling as he slowly breathed in and out. Just as I reached the part where the devious Zeke would betray the great king, my father made one last groan. "Love you." "I love you too, Father," I whispered. He gave a slow nod and closed his eyes for one final time. "Goodbye, Father." I closed the book. For the first time in years, no maple leaf was used to mark the page. There was no need. I stood up and walked over to the still figure of my father, still half buried in the rubble. I gently pried open one of the massive clawed hands and placed the book in it. I closed the talons around it. I turned and saw my companion standing sheepishly in an alcove. We wanted to give you space," Vendrick said embarrassingly. "It's all right," I said, packing my gear into my bags. "Thank you." Bean placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I nodded appreciatively at the gesture. "We should get moving," I said. "You're not staying?" Beam asked, surprised. I looked around at the ruined courtyard and the now quiet form of my father lying peacefully. "No," I shook my head. "There's nothing here for me now." My companions nodded. We turned towards the gates and started the long trek back towards the foothills of Timbershot, back to the place where we all met and where our adventure began those many months ago. The end.